It's always astonishing to any of us who visited North Korea to think about them having a sophisticated weapons program, because if you look at a North Korean pencil or a piece of paper, it will crumble in your hands. The lead will fall out of the pencil. I mean, they can't make a pair of shoes, yet they're making, atomic weapons.
So what is a typical home? What does a typical home look like? Do they have appliances of any sophistication? Well, if they don't have electricity, does it really matter if they have appliances?
It does not matter. I mean, I'll tell you more about...
They have TV? They have radio?
If you're wealthy, you have a TV and radio. I mean, I'll tell you about a typical home in Shenzhen. Now, I would say I've been to Pyongyang 3 times. I have not been in a typical home. If you're allowed in somebody's home, it's a showcase home. But when I was working on this book, I walked 3 people through, what does your home look like? And it was always very funny to me. I'm glad you asked this question, because they would always say, well, it's just like a typical North Korean home. And I would say, yeah, I grew up in a typical New Jersey suburb. What did I have in my house? The main characters in my book grew up in what was called a harmonica house. And this is a harmonica because it's chambers, and there might be 5 single rooms that are attached. And on one side, there's entrances, and you walk in, and there's a sort of a kitchen space that's a bit lower. In traditional Korean homes, the heating is underneath, and the stove is built into the floor. And then in the back, there'd be a single room with maybe yellow vinyl on the floor, an empty wall, empty except for the portraits of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. North Koreans are required to have the 2 portraits on their wall. They're not allowed to have anything else on the wall. No family photos, no, doodads, no embroidery.
And do people come and check that out?
They do come and check that out. They come and inspect pretty regularly. And the North Koreans also have a special cloth that goes in its own box, and you're supposed to dust the portraits. And it's funny, when I've been in Pyongyang, I like to walk around at night so I can peek in people's windows if they have electricity, and you can see in the apartment blocks, the rows of portraits. And then other stuff, I mean, the North Koreans will judge themselves by how many appliances they have. I mean, people who are wealthy will have a TV or a radio. Those are usually, given to you by your workplace. You can't just go out and buy them. But traditionally, if you had a certain kind of job, you could get them. And the regime did make them available because TV and radio are, the main propaganda instruments.
But they can block out TV and radio from nearby neighbors, South Korea,
yes.
Japan, China.
Your television is fixed to the government channel. The radio is fixed to the government channel. There's an electrical wave inspection bureau that will come and inspect. Now, one of the people in my book, sort of a young intellectual who was a university student in Pyongyang, he went and bought himself a Japanese TV on the black market, and he was fairly clever. And he, put the antenna so that he could get South Korean broadcasts. And people do that, and they do that with radio. But it was very dangerous, and he would have gone to prison camp if he had been caught.
My guest is Barbara Demick. Her book, Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea, is published by Spiegel and Grau. So there is a black market there. Does the government allow the black market to exist?
Grudgingly. When the famine got really bad in the 1990s, they sort of belatedly legalized the markets, and they allowed people to sell, more and more goods. You used to only be able to buy homegrown vegetables at the market. And then the markets began getting, produce from China, manufactured goods, shampoos, shoes, sodas, cookies, and it changes every few months. But Kim Jong-il, the current leader of North Korea, has really tried to turn back the clock, and there are constant efforts to close the markets or restrict them. They've the law bans younger women and men from working at the market. Women have to be in some places 40 or some places 50.
And what's the reasoning behind that?
That the most useful part of the population has to work in the state-owned enterprises, which, even though you may not be getting a paycheck there, and the state-owned enterprise may not be producing anything, you have to report to your job. So
You're saying people go to jobs and then don't do any work?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. This woman in my book, Mrs. Song, who was like a real true believer, talked about how she would go to this factory she went to. She worked in a clothing factory, and they had no electricity, they had no fabric, they had no thread. But she would still have to show up every day. She would have to stay. Sometimes she would sleep. Then she would, attend the propaganda lectures. Sometimes they would clean the factory, but they weren't doing any work and they weren't getting paid. But this was required. And in fact, you could go to a detention camp for shirking your work duty. But people always try to get out of their jobs because they're not getting money, so they try to work on the market. But they really haven't, opened up very much. The market activity is still very, very restricted.
But you describe her as a true believer. So despite all of the hardships, she still believes that Kim Jong-il is a great leader, a brilliant leader?
She believed until the very end. I mean, she saw her paycheck stopped, her food distribution stopped. Her family was living in a city with absolutely no food. Her mother-in-law died. Her husband died. She lost her only son. And, through the end, she thought it was her fault that she had failed and not that the government failed. And, I mean, this, shows the, the overpowering propaganda.
And I want to get to the propaganda in a moment, but I'm curious about who is favored and why. There still is, even though this is supposed to be a classless society, some people do live better than others, don't they?
Yeah, of course they do. And people are rated based on their loyalty to the regime. I mean, this is kind of like the Cultural Revolution in China, except it never ended, and it still persists to this day. There's a core class, but at the very top is Kim Jong-il, his relatives, the country's leaders, the top people in the military, all members of the Workers' Party. The Workers' Party is their communist party. Then you go down to what's called the hostile class, and this is families who have relatives in South Korea, like the young woman who's kind of the heroine of my book. Her father was from South Korea. He had fought in the Korean War as a South Korean soldier, was taken prisoner of war, and then eventually assimilated into North Korean society.
So they were always held in suspicion.
Yeah, and contempt, and they were members of the lowest class, Christians, anybody who was suspect for some reason. And then there's a big wavering class in the middle, but you are ranked. People have a good sense of where they rank, and your opportunities in life, are limited by what your class is. It's very Confucian.